heard me say it time and time again. All effective communication starts from within. This is part 2 of self and human communication. And off we go. What are we learning about today in this screencast? First, we're going to really mostly focus on self-disclosure. So first, we'll define self-disclosure. We'll look at factors that influence what people self-disclose. We'll talk about the risks and the rewards, sort of pros and cons of self-disclosure. And lastly, we'll look at communication around self-disclosure and how to do it effectively. As always, take notes. I would say most importantly, tweet. And when you tweet, remember to use the hashtag for the class, but also tweet ideas that you hear in the screencast. Take an idea, paraphrase it, synthesize it, put it in your own words, and tweet it out there for the world. Let's talk about what is self-disclosure. Going back to the Johari window, we talked about the hidden self, which is those things that I know about me that no one else knows. And so self-disclosure are statements that people make that reveal things from the hidden self. And that's really what we're doing, is we're taking those things that no one knows about us and expressing them to others and making them and putting them into the open self. They can come in a lot of different forms, but generally these are overt statements. I choose to make these statements and I put them out there. They don't need to be secrets in any way. We're not talking about secrets. We're talking about clear and open statements that we make to others. They can also be slips of the tongue. Whoopsie, I didn't mean to say that, or I shouldn't have said that, but it slipped out. And we can remember that communication is irreversible. But slips of the tongue can certainly result in self-disclosure. Self-disclosure can also be unconscious nonverbal movements. I'm nervous. I'm scratching my face. I'm twisting my beard. I've got tapping hands. We can disclose how we feel from unconscious nonverbal movements. Also smiles, embarrassment. And so how people feel can be disclosed non-verbally. And of course, public confessions and outing. Outing's a really interesting concept where outing is third-party self-disclosure. So think of the paparazzi. The paparazzi makes a living off of going around, finding out things about people they don't want to be known, and outing them, putting it out to the public. And so that would be third-party self-disclosure. Factors influencing self-disclosure, first of all, is who you are. Generally, more introverted and quiet people tend to self-disclose less, just as opposed that extroverted, outgoing, confident people self-disclose more. Studies show that people that self-disclose more tend to be seen as more credible. Whether they are or not remains debatable, but that makes sense, because if you're disclosing more, it's probably because you have more self-confidence and you're willing to put yourself out there and take risks. And so definitely who you are influences that, as well as your culture. People from masculine cultures tend to disclose less because self-disclosure can be seen as a weakness in some cultures, where as you're divulging your weaknesses, divulging yourself in masculine cultures can be seen as weak-spirited. Just the opposite, in feminine cultures, self-disclosure is much more acceptable, where people are encouraged to open up, share their feelings, share who they are. Same thing with gender. These same ideas fit along with gender, where men tend to self-disclose less than women, and women tend to be more comfortable with self-disclosing things personal to them. Other factors influencing self-disclosure is your audience. Who's in your audience Maybe there's people in your audience you don't want to know these things about, and so you might hold back. Or maybe there's people in your audience you really want them to know these things, and so you take your listeners and your audience into consideration. And lastly, your topic and your channel. You think about, what are you self-disclosing, and what's the topic, and how are you getting your message out there? And you can think about all the different channels that there are: Facebook, social media, billboards. What are you self-disclosing, and how are you getting it out there? It might affect what you self-disclose. Next is the dyadic effect. The dyadic effect says that you are more likely to disclose when the person you are with is also self-disclosing. So generally, studies show that people self-disclose more in one-on-one interpersonal situations or in smaller groups. The larger the group, the less self-disclosure. But the dyadic effect says that if I self-disclose, you should also be more likely to self-disclose something back and reciprocate the self-disclosure. So I tell you something about me, and you reciprocate and tell me something back. Now, when people don't self-disclose back, that's sort of a red flag in an interpersonal relationship. I'm sharing all these things with you, but I'm not getting any self-disclosures back. I'm not learning about you. And this is really how we learn about each other and build a more intimate relationship with people. And of course, this leads you to feel more secure and reinforces your own self-disclosing behavior. Again, you're trust building, you're opening yourself up, you're putting yourself out there, and you would hope that the person, if they feel trust back, they reciprocate it. And that's the dyadic effect. Guidelines for making self-disclosure. First is your motivation. Think deeply and critically about, why are you self-disclosing this? Are you trying to make a friend? Are you trying to build a relationship? Are you trying to get a pat on the back and you need to be stroked? There's a lot of different motivations that people can have for self-disclosure, but you should think about what your motivation is when you do it. Appropriateness. You hear that phrase in our culture, TMI. Too much information. Maybe you cross a line that people don't really want to know what you self-disclosed. Again, reciprocal self-disclosures goes back to the dyadic effect, and so you want to have reciprocal self-disclosures when you make this type of communication. And also consider the burdens that you're putting on others when you tell a secret. Generally, my policy is I don't keep secrets. So when people ask me, hey, Maddie, can you keep a secret? I say no, because I don't want the burden of having to hold someone else's information and not be able to tell others. And so, and that doesn't mean I'm a blabbermouth, but at the same time, I don't think there's much that's healthy about secretive communication. And generally, when you self-disclose, you should be putting it out there in a trusting environment and have good people around you that you trust that aren't going to talk about it. Moving on, there's a lot of rewards for self-disclosure. Some of those would be gaining knowledge about yourself. You can learn a lot about yourself, who you are, what you're comfortable with, what your values are when you self-disclose. We grow as communicators when we when we talk with others and disclose things about ourselves. Improved coping abilities. Again, when you self-disclose, you're taking a risk, and sometimes it doesn't work out, but none of us are perfect, and so we take that risk and we learn to cope with it and move on. Better communication, more meaningful relationships. A lot of good things can come out of self-disclosing, but really talking about better communication and enhancing the relationships in your lives. There's dangers. So what are the cons of self-disclosure? We already know this. Well, I don't want to tell her because she might reject me. There's personal risk, there's relationship risk, and there's professional risks when you self-disclose. And so you want to take those into consideration. And, if it's something that's going to risk these things that are of value to you, you may not want to do it, because the idea is that communication is irreversible. You cannot take it back. And sometimes self-disclosure can get us into real trouble, financial trouble. You self-disclose something inappropriate at work, you lose your job. Politicians self-disclose something about their lives, they don't get elected or they get ousted out of office. So there is dangers, and so you really have to think critically about what you're doing. Let's look at some responding and resisting self-disclosure. First, in responding to self-disclosure, practice effective listening. So really, when people are disclosing to you, make good eye contact, have back-channeling cues, show interest, and be a good active listener. Next, support and reinforce. So again, confirming messages, positive messages to the person that's self-disclosing to you. Next, be willing to reciprocate. So if someone tells you something about them, give it back to them. Tell them something on the same topic about you. Keep self-disclosures confidential. So this is something to really think about, that, when I self-disclose, I know I can have my 6 best friends in the room and tell something about me, and I know it's not going to go any further. So really, it's your responsibility as a listener to keep self-disclosures confidential and not go blab in the dining hall about what someone just told you about themselves. And outing, and that's that third-party self-disclosure again. So you learn something about someone and you go tell the world, and not okay. Don't use self-disclosures against the person. So now that I know this information about you, I can blackmail you. Not a good idea. And again, not very mature, not a good effective communication. And then lastly, use meta messages and feed-forward messages. So you might say something like, that's a really fascinating thing about you. And you're using meta messages that comment on the communication that's happening. Wow, that's really interesting, or that sounds difficult. And using messages that reflect back on that self-disclosure. Let's look at resisting pressures to self-disclose. First of all, my mom told me you never have to answer any question that anyone asks of you. So don't be pushed into answering a question. Generally, I might say something like, that's an interesting question. And when you hear me say that, you can be sure I'm not going to answer you. So don't be pushed into answering a question. You don't have to. You can be indirect, and that meta message that I just used is indirect. And it's commenting on the question. That's an interesting question, but let's move on to this, and you kind of bypass it. But you can be indirect and shifts topics, and hopefully the listener picks up on that. Be assertive if that doesn't work. I really am not comfortable talking about that. So I'm assertive, I say no, and let's talk about something else. And those are all meta message examples that you can use to respond. And again, don't feel pressure to self-disclose if you don't want to. Let's keep going. That wraps it up. What did we cover? We covered what self-disclosure is. We looked at the factors that influence it. We looked at risks and rewards. And also we talked about communicating around self-disclosure. Some things to consider. Share an example of a time when you were rewarded for self-disclosure and a time when you were punished for self-disclosure. So that would be on the forum. And also, how'd you do with tweeting? Did you mass tweet? Did you get some tweets out? And I hope you pushed out a bunch of tweets with the hashtag, and that's telling me a lot about what you're thinking about in the screencast. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed the screencast.